there is a ground stop on our airport, and this thing is up in the sky.
This thing, now believed by the United States to be a Chinese government spy balloon, flying 60,000 feet up in the atmosphere over the country.
We do know that the balloon has violated U.S. airspace and international law, which is unacceptable.
U.S. defense officials have been tracking it closely for several days, debating whether to shoot it down and advising President Joe Biden it would be too dangerous.
We assess that it does not pose a risk to people on the ground as it currently is traversing the continental United States. And so, out of an abundance of caution, cognizant of the potential impact to civilians on the ground from a debris field, right now we're going to continue to monitor and review options.
The news breaking just days before Secretary of State Antony Blinken was due to travel to Beijing, the administration's highest-level trip to China so far. The trip now postponed, despite a rare Chinese apology and claim that the balloon was for civilian purposes and floated off course.
The presence of this surveillance balloon in U.S. airspace is a clear violation of U.S. sovereignty and international law, that it's an irresponsible act, and that the PRC's decision to take this action on the eve of my planned visit is detrimental to the substantive discussions that we were prepared to have.
The Pentagon says steps have been taken to protect sensitive intelligence targets on the ground. The balloon is the size of 3 buses, equipped with solar panels for power and a surveillance payload. Satellite and other data indicate the balloon may have originated in central China, with weather patterns pushing it out over the Pacific Ocean into Canada and down into the United States, where it has been crossing Montana and into Missouri. It can maneuver itself and has changed course, currently floating over the central U.S., officials say, while offering little more on its precise location.
The public certainly has the ability to look up in the sky and see where the balloon is.
And they have, curiously training eyes and cameras towards the skies.
What planet is that?
And Jake, Secretary Blinken has said that he will reschedule his trip to Beijing as soon as conditions allow. What those conditions are, they will not say, but clearly the temperature needs to come down. We just heard Secretary Blinken say now the #1 priority is to get this balloon out of our airspace. The Pentagon believes that this could be several more days, in fact, so they will keep watching it as it floats on by, keeping their options open. Jake?
All right, Alex Marquardt at the U.S. State Department for us. Thank you so much. Let's bring in CNN Senior International Correspondent Ivan Watson in Hong Kong, CNN National Security Correspondent Kylie Atwood, and CNN Aviation Correspondent Pete Montine. And Pete, I want to start with your brand new reporting. You're learning that pilots are reporting seeing this balloon during their flights.
Well, it was only a matter of time before pilots started spotting this, Jake. They're flying at high altitudes, and what's so interesting is that they're reporting this balloon only a few thousand feet above them. Look at this report from the crew of a Cessna Citation private jet flying at 43,000 feet. They said, derelict balloon adrift at 50,000 feet, only a 7,000-foot difference there. They reported that not all that long ago near the Kansas City, Missouri International Airport. What is also so interesting here is that the Pentagon says the balloon was cruising at 60,000 feet. So there's a question here about whether or not this balloon is descending. Remember, airliners are typically at an altitude of about 30,000 feet. So the other big question here is whether or not this balloon will descend and have more of an impact on commercial air travel in the U.S. We have already seen that happen once before. On Wednesday, there was a ground stop and flights were diverted from about a 200-mile swath of airspace between Helena and Billings, Montana. We know that lasted for 2 hours. Now the question is whether or not there will be more ground stops because of this and how this balloon will descend to the ground. Will it pop or will it come down gracefully? Remember, what goes up has to come down, Jake.
And Ivan, Secretary Blinken's trip to China has been postponed. No future dates have been announced. We should note, it's not often that a visit to such a significant adversary is made by a Secretary of State, much less canceled. It seems like a fairly significant diplomatic breach here.
Absolutely. This is a big deal. And the relationship between the U.S. and China have really soured over the past couple of years. this trip by Blinken was supposed to be building on a meeting between President Biden and the Chinese leader Xi Jinping in Bali at the G20 summit in November. The Biden administration had been complaining that Chinese officials simply weren't talking to U.S. officials, and there had been an agreement to reopen lines of communication and try to build guardrails to prevent the world's two largest economies, the tensions from spiraling out of control. So now you have this serious incident, which Blinken, we just heard him speaking from Korea, calling it irresponsible, a violation of international law, a violation of U.S. airspace and sovereignty, but also saying, hey, we've been able to communicate directly about this to prevent the tensions from spiraling out of control. That seems to be paying some dividends right now. At the same time, though, the Biden administration has said we cannot have this visit at this time, that this is going to be a distraction, and there's a major problem here. So I do think we're seeing some results of that diplomacy right now. The big question, what to do about this balloon, and I'm sure that U.S. security officials would love to get their hands on the technology that the balloon is carrying right now.
Yeah, indeed. And Kylie, the Pentagon confirmed today this is not the first time a surveillance balloon has appeared over the United States, but previous instances were not made public. So why is this time different? Just because people in the public saw it?
I think that's part of it. I also think the fact that it happened on the eve of the Secretary of State's planned visit is also quite consequential here. We heard that from senior State Department officials today saying, yes, this has happened before, but this is happening before this major visit that we had all been planning for. We don't think that visit can now be as productive as we had hoped. That's why they're pulling it down. We heard just now from the Secretary of State saying that the decision to take this action is detrimental on behalf of China. What that indicates is that the United States believes that it was deliberate that China actually allowed or sent this spy balloon over the United States. Perhaps it was even deliberate that it happened right before this trip was going to go ahead, sort of to test the United States. The other thing that he said is that the United States right now is focused first and foremost on getting this spy balloon out of U.S. airspace. What they're asking China to do, we really don't know, but he didn't count out any additional repercussions for China as a result of this, violating U.S. sovereignty, other than pulling down his trip. Jake?
And Ivan, on CNN earlier today, the former Secretary of Defense under Donald Trump, Mark Esper, said he finds it curious that the Chinese government is making excuses instead of outright denying that it's their balloon. What do you make of how Chinese officials are handling this?
I'm really stunned, actually. I mean, I've been based here in Hong Kong for more than 7 years, Jake. I've never heard the Chinese government expressing regret over its actions before. Something akin to an apology right here. Basically coming out and saying, yes, this is our balloon, and it's flown off course. They've claimed that it is a meteorological balloon, which, of course, the Pentagon has challenged that description of this thing. But it is a far cry from the tone that we have typically heard in past years, this so-called wolf warrior diplomacy that's come out of the Chinese government and Chinese officials, where they're aggressive and nationalistic and pounce on things. Instead, here, there is acknowledgement that this is theirs. Maybe part of this has to do with the fact that Americans can see this thing with the naked eye. The Chinese government is very opaque, so it's hard to know what could be the motivation for sending this thing up in the air at this time. Is it deliberate? Is it in fact an accident that this thing blew off course? But it is a huge symbol right now, and it's not just affecting the U.S. China has summoned Canada has had to summon the Chinese ambassador there because it flew through Canadian airspace as well. So it does look embarrassing, I could argue, for the Chinese government to have this giant thing floating around, especially when China makes such a big deal about infringements on its own national sovereignty and accuses the U.S. of this almost on a daily basis.
And Kylie, you spoke to some family members of one of the Americans currently wrongfully detained in China, and they were closely watching Secretary Blinken's trip to Beijing to see if their cases were going to be brought up. They must be very disappointed in some ways.
Of course, this was an opportunity for them. They were really hoping that the Secretary of State was going to raise all 3 Americans who are wrongfully detained in China in these meetings and potentially, get some action on some back and forth to try and get their release. But as we have seen in U.S.-China relations, when there's one bad thing, it often happens to have ripple effects on other efforts that they're trying to get going underway. So this is not a good thing for these families.
Pete Muntean, Ivan Watson, Kylie Atwood, thanks so much.